Hi, I'm Becky. Ashlyn is also with me, and we're planning to cover chapters 5 and 6 in Heppner's book, Research Design and Counseling. I'll be covering chapter 5, identifying research topics and operationalizing topics, and Ashlyn will be covering chapter 6, choosing research designs. But before we jump into that information, I'd like to ask you to consider a couple Bible verses regarding why we do research. 1 John 4:1 says, "Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God, for many false prophets have gone out into the world." And Ecclesiastes 12:9 through 10 says, "Besides being wise, the preacher also taught the people knowledge, weighing and studying and arranging many proverbs with great care. The preacher sought to find words of delight, and uprightly he wrote words of truth." So we research for our own purposes in order to discern what is true and not true, and then to pass on that knowledge to others, making sure that we do great care in doing so with excellence. So moving on to chapter 5. There are 5 main components for selecting a topic and then developing the idea into a testable hypothesis or question. These components include identifying research topics, specifying research questions, formulating operational definitions, identifying research variables, and collecting and analyzing the data. When identifying research topics, it's important to consider the following. What are topics that interest you? What knowledge already exists regarding these topics? What are topics that will contribute to the field? And are you planning to contribute or test pre-existing information? It's important not to underestimate the value of replicating a prior study, as they can corroborate or challenge earlier findings. Specifying research questions and hypotheses. This step moves from just the topic to a more focused perspective. Familiarity with current literature regarding the topic can provide insight into what information is already available and what information is lacking. Here's where you can decide if you want to contribute new information or build upon previous information, or if you want to challenge or corroborate prior information. This is why it is so essential to be aware of current literature. Heppner even makes the suggestion of devoting several hours a week to reading scholarly material in order to increase our knowledge base. So research questions and hypotheses differ in that questions explore the relationship between constructs, and hypotheses state an expected relationship between constructs. All constructs must be measurable and testable. There are 3 types of research questions. Descriptive questions focus primarily on what phenomena and events are like. They ask questions such as what is, how often, what percentage, and data is typically gathered through surveys, interviews, and inventories. Different questions will focus on the differences and or comparisons of groups of people and groups of individuals, with data being collected through experimental designs. And relationship questions focus on how constructs relate to one another, and data is typically collected with a correlation design. Next, we move on to the formulating operational definitions. Here we take the generalized ideas and narrow them even further, making them specific and measurable. The purpose in this step is to create a specific outline of activities or operations needed to measure the constructs in this particular experiment. The researcher's next step involves identifying variables. Variables are simply the components with the experiment that are changing. The independent variable is the one that is altered by the researcher. The dependent variable is what is observed to see how it responds to the changes made by the independent variable. In other words, the dependent variable is dependent on the independent variable. And lastly, we focus on collecting and analyzing data. There are several steps in this process, including determining your target population, creating a participant pool, the selection of participants, and determining the number of participants. How the data is collected will depend upon the type of research design, which Ashlyn's going to cover in Chapter 6. The primary purpose of all collected information serves to test the research question or the hypothesis. In summary, Chapter 5 focuses on the initial steps in establishing the foundation for a research study. You're identifying your research topics, specifying your research questions, formulating the operational definitions, and identifying research variables, and collecting and analyzing your data. But I also want to go back to the initial question from earlier in this presentation. Why do research? Why not just take somebody else's word for it? There can be a temptation to simply use what we think is good or neglect what we don't really want to use and simply regurgitate our findings without really comprehending them. That leads to the greater risk of forgetting that we represent the God of the universe. He delights in revealing himself to us. Sometimes that comes through his still and soft voice, and other times that comes through scientific method and experimentation. Both are good. And it's important that as his stewards, we're intentionally pursuing both with excellence. Our God was the first composer, the original artist, creating and designing a world that reflects himself. If we really believe that, shouldn't we be the first ones to step into loving and researching this very creation that provides the evidence of his existence? So thank you for letting me walk you through Chapter 5. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Ashlyn, who will cover Chapter 6.
Hello everyone, this is Ashlyn Jones. I'm reviewing Chapter 6 in the Heppner text, Quantitative Research Methodology. I just want to thank you, Becky. You set us up well to discuss the next chapter on some of the implications of choosing a research design. Before we begin, I want you to ask yourself, what research design do you gravitate towards and why? Is that quantitative or is that qualitative? This answer may reveal a bias or a tendency towards a specific research design. Now, perhaps you answer this question due to your personality, your personal preferences, even your educational background, but I want you to consider this question as we move forward. Chapter 6 starts with discussing the uniformity myth. Now, Heppner takes on the uniformity myth, which is the belief that one's research design might be the best overall. So if you lean towards qualitative, you also think that that is the best way to evaluate a research question. You're invited below to consider some of the implications regarding the uniformity myth and how it may limit the field if only one research design is used. It's best to ask, what is the best research design for this particular problem at this particular time, instead of being prescriptive based on your preferences or your bias. Two quotes from the book help us to consider some of the implications. That research is strengthened when multiple designs are utilized. At any particular time in the history of a topic area, there may be more or less useful ways to approach a specific research question. In fact, there is a growing consensus within and outside the field of counseling that the discipline is strengthened when a wide array of designs are utilized. This highlights the necessity to be open to evaluate the question and what research design would be best to answer that question. The book goes on to explain the bubble concept. The bubble concept is this. Consider when you put a sticker on a car. Typically, an air bubble will form, and if you try to remove the air bubble, it moves just to another part of the sticker. The author uses this analogy to help you think through a research design. No one research design is flawless or covers everything that is needed to know. It's better to understand the limitations than try to remove them completely from the design. This is another quote from the Heppner text. Therefore, as clinicians and researchers, a commitment must be made not only to a methodological diversity, but in creating research that is sound, well-designed, and conscientiously conducted. These two research designs we will talk about. So qualitative research designs are naturalistic, interpretive, and exploratory. Qualitative relies upon relationship between the researcher and the subject of exploration. It uses interview, observations, and artifacts, and it stresses the process of creating meaning to social experience and realities. Quantitative generates and averages data over a large number of participants. It seeks to test hypotheses using the scientific data. Now, here we're looking at numbers data, where versus qualitative research designs are considered language data. Another research design you can utilize is mixed methods. Mixed methods is a utilization of both approaches, a combined use of both qualitative and quantitative research designs. The advantage of this is obviously an increase in knowledge, and it provides a more in-depth understanding. So in one design, you have multiple ways of looking at the data. So while the mixed method design utilizes both approaches, be aware this doesn't necessarily solve the air bubble problem we discussed before. There are still limitations even if both research designs are used. When considering experimental control, we consider the Max-Min-Con principle. And these are basically principles of internal validity. So you want to maximize the variance of variables pertaining to research questions, minimize error variance of random variables due to errors of measurement or participant differences, control variance of extraneous or unwanted variables that may bias variables in question. These are the principles of external validity. How well can the findings be generalized to real-world settings or other populations? I'm going to go quickly through a classification of research designs that I encourage you to look into outside of the scope of this presentation. They are descriptive laboratory studies, descriptive field studies, experimental laboratory studies, and experimental field studies. Now, all of these basically have their own kind of internal validity issues and external validity issues. So when you're choosing a research design, based on a research question, you have to consider 5 factors. Existing knowledge would be the first factor to consider. So identify what has not been answered and what is needed in order to contribute to the knowledge base. So basically contributing to new research. The factor 2 is inference is made to develop existing knowledge base versus research design. Using a research design that has not only been or minimally used in the area of interest. So if there is a question that you have that has been extensively quantitatively researched, consider a qualitative approach in order to enhance the field. Factor 3 is resources and costs associated with research designs. You have to consider finances, lab clinical space, technology, availability of participants. Research design should be feasible and still allow researchers to address a question of interest. The fourth factor is threats to the validity of the specific design. So this goes back to the air bubble. Which research design reduces the size and number of bubbles? Beginning researchers can consider the strengths, limitations of inferences in research based upon design and ways to extend existing research in their study. And factor 5 is don't take any of these 1 factors at face value. What is the match or fit among factors 1 to 4 that could help you decide how to best approach your question? Becky and I want to highlight our sources that we used for this presentation, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to outline Chapter 5 and 6 of Heppner's Research Design in Counseling text. Thank you.